Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever to echo through the dark forests. If you're joining us, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's delve together into a tale that defies logic and remains shrouded in mystery. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It was the autumn of 1891 when icy winds began to blow across Michigan's Upper Peninsula, bringing with them not only the harbinger of a harsh winter, but also whispers of events that would forever mark that region. The vast expanses of dense forest, where centuries-old pines blocked the sunlight even at midday, held secrets that few dared to explore. At that time, Michigan still bore the recent scars of the logging boom, and small isolated communities dotted the territory like islands lost in a green and impenetrable ocean. The region known as County Marquette was a place where time seemed to move differently. The roads were little more than muddy trails carved between the trees, and communication between villages depended on messengers on horseback who took days to cover distances that today we would cross in hours. It was a world apart, where civilization seemed a distant memory and wild nature reigned supreme. Brutal winters isolated entire communities for months, and stories of travelers who never reached their destination were too common to cause immediate alarm. It was in this setting that a sequence of events began to unfold that would defy any rational explanation. It all started when strange reports began to emerge from a specific area of the forest near what the locals called the Valley of Shadows. The name was no mere poetic whim. That narrow valley, surrounded by steep hills covered in dense vegetation, remained shrouded in twilight even during the brightest hours of the day. The topography created a disturbing effect, where sounds were distorted, echoes multiplied in impossible ways, and the feeling of being watched was constant. The first signs that something was deeply wrong emerged when experienced hunters, men who knew those forests like the back of their hands, began returning from expeditions with accounts that defied belief. They spoke of strange structures found deep in the woods, constructions that made no sense at all. They weren't huts or shelters, but something different, something that suggested purpose but whose function remained obscure. Circles of stones arranged in precise geometric patterns, marks carved into trees forming sequences that seemed to follow some unknown logic. But what was truly disturbing wasn't the structures themselves, but the atmosphere surrounding them. Animals avoided the area. Deer that normally roamed the entire region made considerable detours to avoid crossing the valley. Birds didn't perch in the nearby trees. The silence there was absolute, unnatural, as if the forest itself held its breath. And there was something else, something the hunters hesitated to mention, fearing ridicule. They swore that as they approached those structures, they felt a presence, as if invisible eyes followed their every move. The news spread slowly by word of mouth, in taverns and markets of small villages. Initially, many dismissed the accounts as superstition or the effect of prolonged solitude in the forests. But when different hunters, who had no contact with each other, began to describe the same things, disbelief gave way to growing unease. Something was happening in the Vale of Shadows, something that defied common understanding. It was then that the local authorities, pressured by the growing concern of the population, decided to investigate. A small group was formed, composed of men familiar with the region and considered trustworthy by the community. They set off on a foggy November morning, when the cold was already biting the skin, and the ground was beginning to harden with the first frosts. They took provisions for a week, camping equipment, and weapons, not because they expected trouble, but because it was basic prudence when venturing into those inhospitable forests. No one could have predicted that this expedition would mark only the beginning of a sequence of events that would transform the Valley of Shadows into a synonym for mystery and terror. No one imagined that what they would find inside would challenge everything they thought they knew about that land. The days that followed the expedition's departure passed with an agonizing slowness for those awaiting news. Families maintained their routines, but there was a palpable tension in the air. A silent expectation that permeated every conversation, every glance exchanged in the muddy streets of the village. Autumn advanced relentlessly, and the first snowfalls began to paint the distant hilltops white. When the group finally returned, 7 days after their departure, something had changed. Not in their physical appearance, although they were visibly exhausted and covered in the dirt of the journey, but in something deeper, something that shone through in their eyes. It was as if they had witnessed something that words could not adequately capture. For hours they remained silent, refusing to speak about what they had found, until finally, gathered in the small chamber that served as the community's administrative center, they began to recount their experience. The valley, they said, was even more disturbing than initial reports suggested. The stone structures were not accidental or natural formations. There was intention there, deliberate purpose in every arrangement. But what was most disconcerting was the scale of what they found. They weren't just a few isolated circles, but dozens of them, scattered over a vast area, connected by trails that seemed to follow some pattern that defied immediate comprehension. And there was more. Objects left among the stones, metal, and wooden artifacts that didn't correspond to anything known in that region. One of the men, a veteran of many expeditions through the Michigan forests, described the feeling of being constantly watched. No matter where they turned, the impression of hidden eyes following them remained, and there were the sounds. During the night, when they camped near the valley, they were disturbed by noises coming from the darkness. They weren't the sounds of known animals, not the howl of wolves or the growl of bears. They were strange vocalizations, almost human, but distorted in a way that chilled the blood. Even more unsettling was what they found in one of the larger structures, a circular formation approximately 10 meters in diameter. In the center, there were clear signs that fires had been lit there repeatedly. The ashes were recent, perhaps only a few weeks old. Someone or something was using that place, not in the distant past, but in the present. The discovery brought a new dimension of urgency to the mystery. They were not dealing merely with vestiges of something ancient and forgotten, but with an active and contemporary presence. Local authorities faced a dilemma: how to proceed with such vague and disturbing information. There was no obvious crime to investigate, no clearly violated law, but the growing unease among the population demanded some form of action. It was then decided that a more thorough, more systematic investigation would be necessary. But before they could organize such an undertaking, new events accelerated the unfolding of the situation. It was in December 1891, when winter was already settling in full force over Michigan, that a lone traveler arrived in the village bringing alarming news. He came from a neighboring community, several miles away, and reported that people from there had also begun to explore the valley, drawn by the rumors spreading through the region. But something had happened to some of these explorers. They had returned changed, speaking of strange visions, of voices whispering promises and threats in the darkness of the forest. What began as curiosity quickly turned into obsession for some. There were reports of people returning to the valley repeatedly, as if drawn by something they couldn't resist. They returned different after each visit, more distant, more disturbed. Some began speaking in languages no one recognized, drawing complex symbols that corresponded to patterns found in the stone structures. The situation was deteriorating in ways no one could have predicted. What had been a local mystery was transforming into something bigger, something that seemed to exert a profound and disturbing influence on those who came too close. And winter, with its relentless cold and its ability to isolate entire communities, was only just beginning. The long nights that were approaching would bring new challenges, new revelations that would further deepen the mystery of the Veil of Shadows. We are now approaching events that will test the limits of what those isolated communities could understand and endure. The valley held secrets dating back to forgotten times, and those secrets are about to emerge from the darkness in unexpected and deeply unsettling ways. The winter of 1892 arrived with a ferocity few in the region could remember seeing before. The snow fell incessantly, piling up in mounds that reached the height of the roofs of the lowest cabins. The wind howled through the forests with an intensity that made the oldest trees creak, as if they were about to collapse at any moment. And it was during that period of forced isolation, when communities were confined and roads became impassable, that events surrounding the Valley of Shadows took an even more disconcerting turn. The stories began to multiply almost organically, passing from person to person through the long winter nights. In gatherings around crackling fireplaces, where families huddled together seeking warmth and companionship, the tales of the valley gained new details, new layers of strangeness. Some of these accounts came from sources considered reliable, people known for their sobriety and practicality, which made it even more difficult to dismiss them as mere fantasy or exaggeration. A merchant who had spent decades traveling between the villages of the region brought a particularly intriguing perspective. He knew the ancient stories told by the people who inhabited those lands long before the arrival of European colonizers. According to these traditional narratives, the Valley of Shadows had always been a place avoided, marked by inexplicable events dating back countless generations. There were mentions of rituals performed there, of a time when that place served as a meeting point for purposes lost in the mists of time. What was both fascinating and disturbing was the consistency between the ancient stories and contemporary events. The descriptions of the stone structures found corresponded surprisingly well to elements mentioned in traditional narratives. The symbols carved into the trees echoed patterns that appeared in ancient artifacts occasionally discovered in the region. It was as if something very old was resurfacing, manifesting itself again after remaining dormant for an undetermined period. But there was also something new happening, something that had no parallel in the old stories. The influence that the valley seemed to exert on those who visited it was intensifying. People who were once pillars of the community, known for their rationality and balance, began to show changes in behavior after visits to the region. These were not dramatic or sudden changes, but subtle, gradual ones, as if a slow transformation were taking place in their minds. One of the most remarkable cases involved a cartographer who had arrived in the region months earlier, hired to map the less explored areas of the forest. He was a methodical, disciplined man whose reputation was based on the obsessive precision of his work. After spending several weeks exploring the vicinity of the Valley of Shadows, documenting the geography and characteristics of the region, he returned with maps that defied all logic. The drawings were technically flawless, executed with the skill expected of someone with his experience, but what they showed made no sense. There were structures depicted that could not exist, geographical formations that violated the basic laws of physics, rivers that flowed in impossible circles, hills that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When questioned about these inconsistencies, the cartographer insisted that his maps were accurate, that they represented what he had seen, and there was something in his eyes, an unwavering certainty mixed with a deep unease that made it impossible to simply dismiss him as crazy. This pattern repeated itself with other visitors to the valley. Each one brought back something different, some altered perception of the reality they had witnessed. One naturalist spoke of plants that shouldn't exist in that climate, species he couldn't classify within any known system of taxonomy. A geologist described rock formations that seemed to defy accepted chronology, as if different geological eras coexisted simultaneously in that limited space. As winter progressed and more reports emerged, a disturbing picture began to take shape. The Vale of Shadows was simply not a place with unusual characteristics. It seemed to be a place where the normal rules of reality bent in subtle but profound ways, and this characteristic was becoming more pronounced, as if some kind of threshold was being gradually crossed. Local authorities, already burdened by the practical challenges of keeping communities functioning during the harsh winter, found themselves in completely uncharted territory. There was no precedent, no manual or protocol for dealing with such a situation. The only tools available were careful observation and meticulous documentation of each new development, in the hope that some pattern would emerge, some rational explanation would reveal itself. It was decided that, as soon as spring arrived and conditions allowed for safer travel, a larger, better equipped and more prepared expedition would be organized. But this expedition would have a different objective from previous ones. It would not be merely exploratory, but investigative in the deepest sense. They would seek not only to map and document the valley, but to understand the fundamental nature of what was happening there. Meanwhile, during the months of winter isolation, there were those who remained obsessed with the valley, unable to let it go even when common sense advised caution. Some risked perilous journeys through the deep snow to revisit that place, as if some irresistible force pulled them back. And each time they returned, they brought with them new pieces of a puzzle that seemed to expand endlessly, becoming more complex and perplexing with each revelation. The long winter nights were filled with endless discussions about the meaning of it all. Theories were proposed and discarded, explanations tested and deemed insufficient, and through it all, a growing sense that they were dealing with something far beyond their comprehension, something perhaps best left unexplored. But human curiosity, that irresistible compulsion to know and understand, made it impossible to simply ignore the mystery that pulsed in the heart of that dark forest. Spring finally broke through winter's reign with unexpected violence. The thaw transformed tranquil streams into raging torrents, and snow that had accumulated over months melted in a matter of weeks, revealing a transformed landscape. Michigan's forests emerged from that period of dormancy with an almost aggressive vitality, as if nature itself were eager to make up for the months of icy silence. It was in this context of renewal that the promised expedition finally took shape. The group was larger this time, composed of individuals carefully selected not only for their physical stamina, but for their specific skills. There was a scholar of unusual natural phenomena, a man who had dedicated years to understanding how geography and environmental conditions could create strange illusions and perceptual effects. Alongside him was an expert in ancient structures, someone familiar with the construction methods used by different cultures throughout the centuries. The journey to the Valley of Shadows took 3 full days, along trails that the spring rains had made treacherous and slippery. As they approached the region, even those who had never been there before began to feel something shifting in the atmosphere. It wasn't something easily described, but a subtle change in the air quality, in the way sounds traveled, in the very light filtering through the tree canopy. When they finally reached the valley, they encountered a scene that surpassed even the most detailed descriptions they had heard. The stone structures stretched across a much larger area than previous accounts suggested, some partially hidden by vegetation growing in irregular patterns, as if avoiding certain specific spots. What was most striking was the geometric precision of the arrangements. There was no room for error. Each stone occupied exactly the place it should within the larger pattern. The expert in ancient structures spent hours examining the formations, taking careful measurements, noting every observable detail. His conclusions were simultaneously enlightening and disturbing. The technique used in the construction did not correspond to any known method of the region's indigenous cultures, nor to the practices of the European colonizers. There was a sophistication there that suggested advanced mathematical knowledge, an understanding of proportions and angles that seemed out of place in that temporal and geographical context. Even more intriguing were the symbols carved into the trees surrounding the structures. They didn't form writing in the conventional sense, but seemed to be some kind of notation, a marking system that followed consistent internal rules. The scholar of natural phenomena proposed a fascinating theory. Perhaps those symbols weren't intended for communication between people, but rather markers of something more fundamental, indicators of specific properties of that place that their creators considered important to record. During their days camped in the valley, the expedition conducted a series of simple but revealing experiments. They observed how sound behaved anomalously, echoes emerging from impossible directions, voices being carried over distances far greater than normal acoustics would allow. They noted inexplicable variations in temperature, pockets of cold air persisting even under the direct afternoon sun, while other areas remained strangely warm even at night. There were also moments of disorientation that everyone experienced. Walking in a straight line became surprisingly difficult, and it was easy to lose one's sense of direction, even with clearly visible landmarks. Some group members reported inexplicable feelings of vertigo, as if the very ground beneath their feet wasn't completely solid. These experiences were unsettling precisely because they were subtle, never dramatic enough to be definitively abnormal, but consistent enough to be impossible to ignore. On the 3rd night camped in the valley, something extraordinary happened. The sky was exceptionally clear, cloudless, and the crescent moon provided enough light for the stone structures to cast sharp shadows on the forest floor. It was then that one of the expedition members noticed something that everyone else had somehow overlooked. The shadows weren't behaving correctly. They were moving independently of the light that supposedly created them, lengthening and shortening in patterns that didn't correspond to the moon's position in the sky. This observation triggered a series of new investigations. They began to pay systematic attention to how light interacted with that environment and discovered consistent anomalies. There were times when reflections appeared where there shouldn't be reflective surfaces, when light seemed to bend around objects instead of casting shadows on them. It was as if the basic optical laws were merely suggestions in that place, followed inconsistently. The scholar of natural phenomena developed a laborious hypothesis. Perhaps the specific combination of geological factors, the mineral composition of the rocks, the particular configuration of the terrain, created conditions that affected human perception in profound ways. Perhaps what they were experiencing was not supernatural, but rather natural in a way that defied common understanding. The valley could be a rare geophysical anomaly, a point where unique conditions converged to produce extraordinary effects. But this explanation, however rational it tried to be, couldn't account for everything. It didn't explain the persistent feeling of presence, the impression shared by everyone that something was constantly watching them. It didn't explain the vivid and disturbing dreams that each member of the expedition experienced during the night spent there, dreams that often shared common elements, despite not having been discussed among themselves. When the expedition finally returned to civilization, they brought with them a substantial amount of documentation, detailed drawings, precise measurements, and meticulous observations. But they also brought more questions than answers, and a growing conviction that the Valley of Shadows represented something unique, an enigma that perhaps could not be fully unraveled with the tools and knowledge available. The months following the expedition's return brought a fundamental shift in how the communities surrounding the Valley of Shadows viewed the mystery. What had previously been treated with a mixture of superstitious fear and cautious curiosity had transformed into something more complex, an almost academic fascination that drew people from increasingly distant regions. News of the discoveries had spread in unpredictable ways, crossing county and state borders, reaching the ears of individuals whose interest in unexplained phenomena outweighed any concern for potential dangers. During the summer of 1892, the valley saw a steady stream of visitors. Some came motivated by genuine intellectual curiosity, seeking to understand the reported anomalies through scientific methods and systematic observation. Others were driven by less rational impulses, seeking in the mystery of that place something that their daily lives did not offer, some form of transcendence or connection with forces they imagined to operate beyond mundane reality. And there were also those who simply could not resist the call, people who had visited the valley once and found themselves unable to stay away for long. Among these regular visitors was a figure who gradually became central to the events that would unfold. She was a woman of uncertain origin, who had arrived in the region with no known prior history, identifying herself only as someone who studied patterns in nature. She possessed a remarkable ability to perceive connections that others ignored, to identify hidden regularities amidst apparent chaos. Her presence in the valley became so constant that many began to consider her a kind of unofficial guardian of that place. She was the first to propose that the stone structures were not randomly distributed, but followed a precise pattern related to invisible features of the terrain. She spent entire days walking among the formations, making notes in notebooks that quickly filled with complex diagrams and detailed observations. Her theories were simultaneously fascinating and difficult to verify, suggesting that the valley occupied some kind of convergence point, a place where invisible lines of natural force intersected in unique ways. Other scholars who visited the site began to collaborate with her, comparing their independent observations and discovering surprising correlations. One of these collaborators was a man who dedicated his life to the study of terrestrial magnetism and its variations. He brought sensitive equipment that allowed him to measure magnetic fields with considerable precision, and his readings in the valley revealed pronounced anomalies. There were points where the compass simply refused to point in any consistent direction, rotating slowly as if disoriented, and others where the magnetic field was several times more intense than would be expected. These findings began to form the basis of a more comprehensive theory. Perhaps the Valley of Shadows was a point of significant geomagnetic anomaly, and this feature influenced not only measuring instruments, but also human physiology in subtle ways. The human brain was known to be sensitive to magnetic fields, and prolonged exposure to unusual variations could theoretically affect perception, mood, and even cognitive processes. This would explain the behavioral changes observed in frequent visitors, the feelings of disorientation, perhaps even the vivid dreams shared. But the more they investigated, the more complex the picture became. The magnetic anomalies were only one piece of the puzzle. There were also unusual variations in soil composition, mineral concentrations that made no geological sense, and stratifications that suggested formation processes that did not correspond to the known history of that region. A visiting geologist spent weeks collecting samples and conducting rudimentary analyses on site, concluding that the valley had a fundamentally different geological history from the surrounding areas, as if it had been formed by completely distinct processes, or at a radically different time. The vegetation also presented remarkable peculiarities. Certain plant species grew in excessive abundance within the valley, while others were completely absent. There were trees that displayed bizarre growth patterns, trunks that bent at impossible angles before resuming vertical growth, branches that intertwined forming almost symmetrical geometric patterns. A botanist who spent an entire month documenting the local flora suggested that soil conditions, combined with unique environmental factors, created a microclimate that favored unusual adaptations. As summer progressed and more information was gathered, a picture began to emerge of a completely unique ecosystem, an environment where multiple anomalous factors converged to create conditions that did not exist anywhere else known. And this uniqueness was not merely interesting from a scientific point of view. It had immediate and practical effects on anyone who spent significant time in the valley. The psychological changes were the most documented and the most concerning. People who stayed in the valley for extended periods began to report alterations in their perception of time. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, or conversely, minutes stretched into subjective eternities. This temporal distortion was not measurable by clocks, but it was experienced consistently enough to be impossible to dismiss as mere subjective impression. Some visitors developed a kind of affinity with the place, an intense emotional connection that made it difficult to leave, as if leaving the valley meant abandoning something essential to themselves. There were also those who developed unexpected abilities. One visitor discovered he could predict weather changes with impressive accuracy while in the valley, though this ability disappeared as soon as he returned to civilization. Another reported being able to find groundwater with unerring accuracy, as if he could sense its presence through the soil. These abilities were consistently temporary, specifically linked to physical presence in that location, suggesting that the environment was somehow amplifying latent capabilities or opening normally inaccessible channels of perception. The woman who had become the valley's most dedicated scholar proposed that all these phenomena were interconnected, forming a coherent system if only one could understand the underlying principles. She began to develop a complex theoretical model, suggesting that the valley represented a rare type of confluence, a point where multiple natural forces intersected in ways that amplified their individual effects. According to her theory, it was not necessary to invoke anything supernatural to explain what was happening. Nature alone, operating under sufficiently unusual conditions, was capable of producing effects that would seem magical to those without adequate understanding. But not everyone agreed with this purely naturalistic interpretation. There were voices that insisted that something else was at work, that the observed anomalies were symptoms of something deeper and fundamentally different. These voices argued that the consistency of the symbols in the trees, the geometric precision of the stone structures, the evident intentionality in their arrangement, all this suggested conscious purpose, deliberate planning, and if there was purpose, then there was intelligence behind it, an intelligence that perhaps was still present in some form. The debates intensified during the nights, when groups of scholars and curious onlookers gathered in makeshift camps on the valley's edge. The discussions stretched for hours, theories being proposed and contested, evidence interpreted and reinterpreted. And through it all, the valley remained silent, guarding its secrets, offering clues, but never definitive answers, inviting interpretation, but resisting final conclusions. As autumn began to paint the leaves with shades of red and gold, it became clear that the mystery of the Valley of Shadows would not be easily solved, perhaps never solved at all. What they had discovered was enough to confirm that this place was truly extraordinary, but also enough to reveal how profoundly complex the enigma they faced was. And there was a growing awareness that perhaps some questions were not meant to have answers, that some mysteries should remain inviolate, preserved in their essential ambiguity as reminders of the limits of human knowledge. Autumn brought with it a transformation in the valley's atmosphere that no one could adequately explain. The trees surrounding the stone structures seemed to change color differently from the rest of the forest, acquiring hues that were not typical for those species. Some branches retained their green leaves, while others already displayed deep reds and vibrant golds, creating a visual mosaic that defied normal seasonal patterns. It was as if each tree operated according to its own internal calendar, disconnected from the natural rhythms that governed the world beyond that place. During this period, the woman who had dedicated herself to the intensive study of the valley made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigations. While examining the markings on one of the oldest trees, she noticed that the symbols were not static as everyone had assumed. There were subtle signs that new carvings were being added, recent marks overlapping the old ones. Someone or something was continually modifying those patterns, updating them according to some unknown criteria. This revelation precipitated more systematic surveillance. Small groups began spending entire nights observing the areas where the markings were densest, hoping to witness who or what was making these modifications. The vigils were intense experiences, marked by increasing tension as the hours passed in the darkness. The silence of the valley at night was absolute and oppressive, broken only occasionally by sounds that seemed to come from impossible directions, echoes without an identifiable source. It was during one of these vigils, on a particularly dark October night, that they finally witnessed something. It wasn't dramatic or frightening in the way many had expected. Instead, it was profoundly disconcerting in its subtle strangeness. Shadows moved among the trees in ways that didn't correspond to any visible light source. They weren't shadows of animals or people, but forms without apparent substance, presences that seemed to absorb light rather than simply block it. The observers remained motionless, fascinated and nervous as these shapes moved through the valley. They seemed to congregate around certain stone structures, remaining there for varying periods before dispersing again into the darkness. There was no sound associated with their movements, no physical indication of their passage beyond the visual effect of their presence. And when the first light of morning began to brighten the sky, they simply ceased to be visible, disappearing as if they had never existed. The experience left the observers in a state of profound confusion. What they had witnessed defied easy explanation. It couldn't have been collective hallucinations, since multiple people saw the same things at the same times. It wasn't trickery, since the observations were made under carefully controlled lighting conditions. All that remained was to accept that something genuinely anomalous had occurred, something that didn't fit comfortably into any known category of natural phenomenon. In the following weeks, other groups conducted their own night vigils, and many reported similar experiences. The shadowy shapes became an accepted element of the valley's mystery, yet another piece of a puzzle that was constantly growing in complexity. Some theorized that they were some kind of unique atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps related to the area's magnetic anomalies. Others suggested more exotic explanations, proposing that they were witnessing manifestations of natural energies that contemporary science had not yet identified or understood. The leading scholar of the valley developed her own theory, one that was both bold and carefully grounded in empirical observations. She proposed that the valley functioned as a kind of natural lens, a point where specific conditions allowed the perception of aspects of reality that were normally invisible. According to her model, what they called shadowy forms could be visual expressions of energy fields that existed everywhere, but which only under the unique conditions of the valley became perceptible to human senses. This theory gained adherents among those inclined to seek natural explanations, but it also faced considerable skepticism. Critics pointed out that it did not explain the apparent intentionality of the movements of the forms, the fact that they seemed to purposefully congregate in specific locations. If they were merely natural phenomena, why did they demonstrate what appeared to be deliberate behavior? While these debates continued, the valley went on to exert its peculiar influence on all who approached. The psychological changes in frequent visitors became more pronounced and more diverse. Some developed a heightened sensitivity to subtle changes in the environment, managing to detect impending weather changes or identify the presence of other human beings at impossible distances. Others experienced changes in their sleep patterns, discovering that they needed less rest when they were in the valley, as if the atmosphere itself was somehow invigorating. There were also those who began to experience what they could only describe as heightened mental clarity. Problems that seemed unsolvable outside the valley suddenly became transparent when contemplated within it. Connections between disparate ideas revealed themselves with crystal clarity. It was as if thought flowed more freely, uninhibited by the normal constraints that governed cognitive processes. Some scholars began to deliberately use the valley as a place for intellectual contemplation, bringing complex problems with them in the hope that the peculiar atmosphere of the place would facilitate their solutions. But these positive experiences were balanced by others that were less beneficial. Some people developed an emotional dependence on the valley, becoming restless and irritable when forced to remain away from it for too long. For these people, the world outside the valley seemed somehow diminished, less vivid, less real. This polarization of experiences made it difficult to form a consensus on the fundamental nature of the place. Was it beneficial or dangerous? A resource to be exploited or a threat to be contained? Local authorities, observing these developments with growing concern, began to consider more interventionist measures. There were proposals to restrict access to the valley, to establish limits on how long individuals could spend there, and to require medical supervision for frequent visitors. But implementing such measures was complicated by practical and philosophical issues. How to justify restrictions on a place that, as far as they could determine, had not caused direct physical harm to anyone. How to balance public protection with individual freedom of exploration. As autumn drew to a close and the first icy winter winds began to blow once more through the forests of Michigan, it became clear that the Valley of Shadows had become more than just a local mystery. It had transformed into a phenomenon that defied easy categorization, a place that operated according to its own rules, indifferent to human attempts to understand or control it. And all who engaged with it were forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, and what it truly meant to understand the world around us. The winter of 1893 descended upon Michigan with an intensity rivaling the previous one, but this time the communities around the Valley of Shadows faced seasonal isolation with a different awareness. The mystery they had been investigating for months was no longer a disturbing novelty, but a constant presence in their lives, something that had become interwoven into the fabric of their daily existence. The conversations during the long winter nights no longer revolved around whether the valley was extraordinary, but rather about what to do with this extraordinariness. The scholar who had devoted so much time to the valley made an unexpected decision. Instead of seeking shelter in the villages during the harsh winter, she chose to remain near the valley, building a modest cabin a respectable distance from the stone structures. Her rationale was that the patterns observed during the warmer months might change with the seasonal shifts, and she didn't want to miss the opportunity to document these variations. Some considered her reckless, others admired her dedication, but regardless of opinions, her continued presence at the site would provide insights that no one else was in a position to obtain. During those isolated months, she kept meticulous diaries of her observations. The valley beneath the snow presented even more peculiar characteristics. The snow did not accumulate uniformly. There were areas where it remained untouched for weeks, forming deep mounds, while in other spots, especially around certain stone structures, it melted almost as quickly as it fell, even when temperatures remained consistently below freezing. There was no obvious explanation for these variations. They were not areas exposed to the sun differently, nor places sheltered from the wind in ways that would explain the discrepancy. The shadowy shapes that had been observed during the autumn continued to manifest, but with increased frequency and intensity during the winter months. On the darkest nights when the moon was hidden and only the stars provided faint illumination, they seemed more substantial, almost tangible. The scholar spent countless hours observing them, trying to discern patterns in their movements, seeking to understand what might motivate or guide their seemingly intentional behavior. She noticed that the shapes seemed to respond to certain atmospheric conditions. During snowstorms, when the wind howled through the trees and visibility was reduced to almost nothing, they became more active, moving with an agility that contrasted with the heavy slowness of their movements on calm nights. During the aurora borealis, a phenomenon occasionally visible at that latitude, the shapes acquired an almost luminescent quality, as if they absorbed and re-emitted the dancing light of the sky at subtly altered frequencies. Her notes also documented changes in her own perception and mental state. Prolonged solitude in such a peculiar environment produced effects that she struggled to describe objectively. There were moments of extraordinary clarity, when she felt she understood profound connections between the various phenomena she observed, only to find that these perceptions dissolved like fog when she tried to articulate them in words. There were also periods of temporal disorientation, more pronounced than anything experienced by short-term visitors, entire days that seemed to pass in hours, or nights that stretched into subjective eternities. When spring finally arrived and the paths became passable again, the first visitors to reach the scholar's cabin found her transformed, not physically, for her health seemed remarkably good considering the months of isolation, but in her way of speaking and thinking. She had developed a form of discourse that incorporated concepts difficult to translate, ideas that seemed to make perfect sense in the context of the valley, but lost coherence when expressed in conventional language outside of it. Her winter diaries became the subject of intense study. The pages were filled with detailed observations, but also with increasingly complex diagrams that attempted to map relationships between the various phenomena of the valley. There were sketches of the shadowy forms in different states, notes on how their manifestations correlated with lunar phases, weather patterns, and even variations in geomagnetic activity that she had managed to infer through careful observation with compasses and other sensitive instruments. What intrigued other scholars most was a series of entries suggesting that the scholar had begun to develop some kind of communication with the shadowy forms. It wasn't communication in the conventional linguistic sense, but an exchange of patterns and responses to behaviors. She described how certain actions on her part seemed to evoke specific reactions from the forms, as if a rudimentary protocol of interaction were gradually being established. This claim was met with substantial skepticism, but the consistency of her observations was difficult to completely ignore. During the subsequent spring and summer, the valley saw a resurgence of interest, but now with a different focus. Instead of merely documenting and theorizing, there was a growing impetus to experiment, to test hypotheses in more active ways. Groups began attempting to replicate the scholar's observations, seeking to establish their own interactions with the shadowy forms. The results were mixed and frustrating. Some reported experiences similar to hers. Others observed nothing beyond the already known environmental phenomena. This variability in experiences led to a new line of investigation. Perhaps the valley did not affect everyone in the same way. Perhaps there was something in the individual characteristics of each person, some quality of perception or sensitivity, that determined the degree and nature of their interaction with that place. This theory suggested that the valley was not so much an objective phenomenon as an interface, a meeting point between unique environmental characteristics and specific human capabilities. Rudimentary experiments were conducted to test this hypothesis. People with different backgrounds, temperaments, and histories of valley exposure were systematically exposed to similar conditions, and their experiences were carefully documented and compared. The results suggested that there were indeed significant correlations. Individuals with certain psychological tendencies, certain ways of processing sensory information, seemed more likely to experience the more unusual aspects of the valley. But these discoveries raised more questions than they answered. If the valley functioned as a kind of amplifier of latent capabilities, what implications did this have for understanding human consciousness? If different people could literally perceive different realities in the same physical space, what did this say about the objective nature of reality itself? These philosophical questions intertwined with practical investigations, making it difficult to separate speculation from empirical observation. As the year progressed, and the leaves began to change color again, heralding another autumn cycle, it became clear that the Valley of Shadows had become more than a mystery to be solved. It had become a mirror in which humanity saw its own limitations and possibilities reflected, a place that challenged not only scientific understanding, but the very categories through which we tried to comprehend the world. Autumn brought with it an unexpected event that would dramatically alter the course of everything that had happened up to that point. A visitor arrived in the valley from a distant region, a man who had dedicated his life to studying places considered unusual or sacred by different cultures around the world. He brought with him a radically different perspective, informed by decades of experience with phenomena that defied conventional explanations. His arrival was marked by an approach that contrasted with that of the scholars who had been investigating the valley. While others sought to understand through systematic measurements and analyses, he simply remained silent for hours, sitting beside the stone structures, absorbing the atmosphere of the place without trying to categorize or explain it immediately. When he finally began to share his impressions, his words carried a weight that came from accumulated experience. He suggested that the valley was not unique in the world, but part of a larger category of places that existed on the margins between the ordinary and the extraordinary. According to him, there were other locations scattered across the planet where similar conditions produced comparable effects, although each was unique in its specific manifestations. These places functioned as anchor points for something that transcended physical geography, windows through which normally hidden aspects of reality became momentarily accessible. This perspective was initially met with reservation by more scientifically inclined scholars, who saw in it a regression to mystical forms of thought that they considered outdated. But the visitor was not proposing mysticism in the sense of abandoning reason. Instead, he suggested that rationality needed to expand to accommodate phenomena that did not fit comfortably into existing categories. True wisdom, he argued, lay in recognizing the limits of current knowledge, without presuming that these limits represented the limits of what was possible to know. He spent weeks in the valley, conducting his own observations using methods that seemed more contemplative than analytical. And during this time, something remarkable happened. The shadowy forms, which had been the object of so much fascination and speculation, began to manifest themselves in more definite ways in his presence. It wasn't that he saw them more clearly than others, but rather that they seemed to respond to him more markedly, as if they recognized something familiar or meaningful in his approach. Observers who accompanied him documented interactions that suggested a level of communication that went beyond what the scholar had achieved during her isolated winter. The forms moved in patterns that seemed to respond directly to the visitor's actions, approaching when he remained still, receding when he moved, creating configurations around him that seemed deliberate and meaningful. It was like watching a dance between participants who shared a complex, non-verbal language. When asked how he had managed to establish this rapport, the visitor explained that it wasn't a specific technique, but an attitude. He approached the valley and its phenomena not as problems to be solved, but as a presence to be respected. He didn't seek to control or dominate, but rather to coexist and understand on the terms of the place itself, not just his own. This change of perspective, he argued, was fundamental to any true understanding of places like that. His ideas resonated especially with those who had experienced the most ineffable aspects of the valley, those who felt that something important was being lost in attempts to reduce everything to mechanical measurements and explanations. A subtle division began to form between two approaches, not necessarily conflicting but definitely different in their assumptions and methods. There were those who continued to seek rigorous naturalistic explanations, and those who embraced a more holistic understanding that admitted mystery as a legitimate component of the experience. During this period, the stone structures themselves seemed to reveal new aspects. Under the visitor's guidance, observers began to notice that the stone arrangements were not as fixed as they had assumed. Subtle changes occurred over time, not dramatic enough to be obvious, but definitely present when comparing photographs taken months apart. Some stones shifted slightly, others appeared where none had been before, and occasionally some simply disappeared without a trace of how or why. These observations raised perplexing questions about agency and intentionality. If the structures were changing, something or someone was effecting those changes. But who or what? The shadowy shapes were obvious candidates, but no one had directly witnessed one of them moving stones. There was also the possibility that as yet ununderstood natural processes were at work, forces affecting physical matter in ways that contemporary physics did not recognize or could not explain. The visitor offered an interpretation that many found both fascinating and difficult to accept. He suggested that the valley might be a place where the line between observer and observed becomes blurred, where human attention not only registers phenomena but actively participates in their manifestation. According to this view, the changes in the stone structures could be partly a result of the investigators' own presence, their expectations and intentions subtly influencing what happened. This idea was deeply unsettling for those committed to notions of scientific objectivity, but it resonated with certain experiences many had had in the valley. The feeling that the place responded to human presence, that it changed in some subtle way based on who was there and how they approached it. If this were true, then studying the valley was not simply observing it, but participating in a complex dialogue where both sides influenced the other. As autumn progressed and the discussions deepened, a new understanding began to emerge. Perhaps the question was not about choosing between scientific explanation and acknowledging mystery, between rational analysis and accepting the ineffable. Perhaps true wisdom lay in maintaining both perspectives simultaneously, in recognizing that the valley operated on multiple levels of reality that required multiple forms of understanding to be adequately grasped. The visitor finally departed as quietly and unceremoniously as he had arrived, but his influence remained. He had opened up possibilities of thought that many had not considered before. He had suggested that the true mystery of the Valley of Shadows lay not in finding a single definitive explanation, but in learning to inhabit ambiguity, to live comfortably with questions that perhaps had no final answers. And perhaps, his approach suggested, this acceptance of mystery was not intellectual defeat, but a deeper form of wisdom. The years that followed brought a gradual but profound transformation in how the Veil of Shadows was understood and inhabited by the communities around it. What had begun as a disturbing mystery had evolved into something more complex, a presence that intertwined with daily life in ways no one could have foreseen. People learned to live with the ambiguity of the place, developing a kind of practical wisdom that recognized both its potential dangers and its extraordinary possibilities. The scholar who had spent that isolated winter near the valley became a kind of unofficial guardian, someone people consulted before making extended visits. She had developed an intuitive understanding of how the valley operated, what conditions made it more or less accessible, what practices helped visitors navigate its peculiarities without becoming completely disoriented. Her knowledge was not systematic in the traditional scientific sense, but it was profoundly practical and surprisingly effective. Over time, a kind of culture began to emerge around the valley. There were informal rituals that regular visitors developed, not out of superstition, but because experience demonstrated their usefulness. Approaching the valley at dawn or dusk, moments of transition between light and darkness, seemed to facilitate more coherent experiences. Spending initial time simply sitting in silence, allowing the senses to adjust to the peculiar atmosphere of the place, helped to minimize disorientation. These practices were passed down among visitors, forming a collective wisdom accumulated through countless individual experiences. The stone structures continued to change slowly over the years, their patterns evolving in ways that suggested some kind of organic process, as if they were less static monuments and more living organisms in constant transformation. Some circles disappeared completely, their stones scattering or simply vanishing, while new arrangements emerged in places that were previously empty. The scholar kept meticulous records of these changes, and over the years a pattern began to emerge, a cycle that seemed to correspond not only to seasons, but to longer cycles that took years to complete. The shadowy shapes became an accepted part of the valley experience, their presence no longer causing the alarm it initially provoked. Regular visitors developed a familiarity with them, learning to interpret their movements and behaviors as indicators of specific conditions in the place. When the shapes were particularly active, certain areas of the valley became more intensely anomalous, and experienced visitors knew it was prudent to keep a respectful distance. When they remained quiet or absent, the valley took on a more tranquil character, though never completely ordinary. Over the years, there have been attempts to document the valley in more permanent ways. Artists came to create visual representations, only to find that the place resisted being faithfully captured in painting or drawing. The images they produced were always somehow inadequate, lacking the essential quality that made the valley what it was. Writers tried to articulate their experiences in prose, but the words seemed to slip around the core of the issue, circling without ever truly reaching the center. It was as if the valley possessed a fundamental quality that resisted representation, that could only be known through direct experience. During this period, the surrounding communities developed a pragmatic relationship with the valley. It was no longer seen as a threat or simply as a curiosity, but as a resource of a peculiar kind. People came from considerable distances, seeking the experiences of mental clarity that the valley occasionally provided, hoping to use these windows of heightened perception to solve persistent problems or gain insights into issues that troubled them. It didn't always work, but it worked often enough to maintain interest. There were also those who sought the valley for more personal and ineffable reasons. People going through transitional moments in their lives, facing significant losses or changes, found in the valley a space where they could process their experiences in ways that seemed impossible in ordinary environments. The peculiar atmosphere of the place, its quality of existing slightly apart from the normal flow of time and reality, offered a kind of temporary sanctuary where perspectives could shift and new understandings could emerge. But the valley also held its dangers. There were occasional cases of people who spent excessive time there and developed difficulties reintegrating into normal life. For these people, the ordinary world seemed diminished after prolonged exposure to the intensities of the valley, and they struggled to find meaning or purpose in ordinary circumstances. The scholar and other informal guardians learned to identify warning signs, intervening when necessary, to help people maintain a healthy balance between their experiences in the valley and their lives beyond it. Over the years, stories about the valley spread widely, attracting attention from ever-widening circles. But something curious happened to these stories as they traveled far from their origin. They transformed, acquiring dramatic or sensationalist elements that did not correspond to the more subtle reality of the place. In distant versions of its history, the valley became something much simpler and less interesting than it actually was, reduced to stereotypes of haunted places or mystical portals. Those who knew the valley intimately recognized that these simplified versions completely missed the point. The true meaning of the place lay not in dramatic phenomena or supernatural revelations, but in something quieter and deeper. It lay in the way the valley invited people to question their certainties, to acknowledge the limits of their understanding, to remain open to possibilities that could not be easily categorized or explained. It was a place that taught humility, not through explicit lessons, but through the direct experience of encountering something genuinely other, something that operated according to logics that challenged fundamental assumptions. And so the valley remained, through the seasons and years, a strangely quiet spot in the Michigan landscape, continuing to exert its peculiar influence on all who approached with open minds and receptive hearts. It offered no easy answers or definitive conclusions, but perhaps that was precisely its most important virtue, its most valuable contribution to those willing to encounter it on their own terms. Time continued its relentless flow through the decades, and the Valley of Shadows remained, as it always had been, a silent enigma nestled deep within the forests of Michigan. The stone structures followed their mysterious cycle of transformation, moving at rhythms that defied any human chronology, rearranging themselves according to logics that remained perpetually out of reach. The shadowy forms continued their nocturnal dances among the trees, manifestations that became as familiar as they remained inexplicable. The scholar who had dedicated so many years to that place, now with silver hair and eyes that carried the weight of countless contemplations, still walked among the stone circles with the regularity of one performing a sacred ritual. She had become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient trees themselves, a constant presence that witnessed the subtle changes of the valley through the seasons and years. When young visitors arrived seeking to understand the mystery, she received them patiently, sharing not answers, but perspectives cultivated through decades of silent observation. His cabin near the valley had become an informal meeting place for those seriously interested in exploring the peculiarities of that place. Around his fireplace, during cold nights when the wind whispered through the trees outside, conversations unfolded that attempted to weave together the disparate threads of individual experiences into something that might approach collective understanding. But even after so many years, even with so many brilliant minds devoting attention to the problem, the valley maintained its fundamental essence untouched, preserved behind veils that refused to be fully lifted. In the winter of 1902, a particularly severe snowstorm isolated the region for weeks. When the trails finally became passable again and the first visitors managed to reach the valley, they discovered that significant changes had occurred. Several of the larger stone structures had completely rearranged themselves, forming new patterns that no one had seen before. It was as if the valley took advantage of periods of total isolation to carry out transformations it preferred to keep private, changes that happened away from prying eyes. These discoveries renewed discussions about the nature of the valley. There were those who argued that the changes were the result of natural geological processes, perhaps freeze-thaw cycles affecting the soil in ways that moved the rocks. Others maintained that there was intentionality in the rearrangements, that the patterns followed a deliberate logic, suggesting conscious purpose. And there were also those who had come to accept that perhaps both perspectives were simultaneously true, that the valley operated at a level where distinctions between natural and intentional ceased to make sense. When asked about these changes, the scholar would simply smile enigmatically. She had learned long ago that the valley did not reveal itself through analysis or debate, but through patient presence and open receptivity. The changes were simply another aspect of its fundamental nature, another manifestation of its essential quality of being something that existed on the margins, something that refused comfortable categorization. During those years, the valley continued to exert its peculiar influence on those who approached it. Experiences of heightened mental clarity remained common, as did sensations of temporal disorientation. Visitors still reported vivid dreams after spending time in the valley, dreams that often carried unexpected insights into problems that plagued them, and the shadowy forms continued their nocturnal manifestations, now accepted as an integral part of the experience of the place, no longer causing the alarm they initially provoked. There was a timeless quality to the way the valley existed. While the world beyond the forests changed rapidly, while new inventions transformed daily life and old certainties were constantly challenged, the valley remained essentially unchanged. It was as if it existed in a pocket separate from time, operating according to its own rhythms that did not correspond to the accelerated pulse of modernity spreading across the country. This quality became part of its appeal. In an era of ever-increasing change, the valley offered something rare, a space where time still moved differently, where it was possible to slow down and exist in ways of being that were rapidly being forgotten in the world beyond. People came not only to study its anomalies, but to temporarily escape the relentless speed of modern life, to rediscover slower, more contemplative rhythms. The scholar observed these changing motivations with quiet interest. The valley was becoming not only an object of investigation, but a sanctuary of a peculiar kind. And perhaps, she reflected, that had always been one of its purposes. Although purpose was perhaps too strong a word. Perhaps it was simply something the valley allowed, a use that people found for its unique qualities. The communities around the valley had developed over the years a practical wisdom about how to relate to it. There was a tacit understanding of boundaries that should not be crossed, of respect that should be maintained. These were not formal rules, but shared understandings that emerged from collective experience. And these understandings were passed down through generations, becoming part of the local culture, in ways that were both profound and subtle. There were occasional attempts to explore the valley in more invasive ways, to conduct excavations or install permanent monitoring equipment. But these attempts invariably failed in inexplicable ways. Equipment constantly malfunctioned, excavations encountered inexplicably hard soil, or were flooded by underground springs that appeared out of nowhere. It was as if the valley actively refused certain types of intervention, tolerating respectful observation, but resisting aggressive invasion. The scholar kept her diaries throughout all those decades, volume after volume filled with meticulous observations, philosophical reflections, sketches and diagrams. They represented a life dedicated to a single enigma, a journey that began with a search for answers, but evolved into something deeper, a form of relationship that transcended the need for definitive explanation. Her writings became valuable resources for those who came after, not because they provided solutions, but because they mapped the terrain of experience, offering guidance on how to navigate the peculiarities of the valley without being completely disoriented by them. And so the valley continued, through the seasons and years and decades, keeping its secrets while generously offering partial glimpses, inviting exploration while resisting domination. It was a place that taught lessons about the limits of knowledge, about the value of mystery, about the importance of recognizing that not everything in the world can or should be fully understood. And perhaps that was its greatest gift, not the specific anomalies it manifested, but the attitude of humility and openness it cultivated in those willing to encounter it on their own terms. We conclude here this journey through the shadows and mysteries that inhabit the deep forests of Michigan, a story that reminds us that the world still holds places where the extraordinary whispers on the fringes of the ordinary, where questions remain unanswered and mystery maintains its sacred territory. If you've made it to the end of this narrative, leave a comment sharing your reflections on this story. Subscribe to the channel for more